pleased to introduce Dr. Siegfried Spellar. Dr. Siegfried is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer and Information Technology at Purdue University. She has several publications, book chapters, and conference paper presentations, including international presentations in India, Ireland, Russia, and South Korea on the who and why of cybercrime. She studies the personality characteristics and socio-legal factors associated with cyber deviance, including internet child pornography use, hacking, cyberbullying, trolling, and cyber threats via social media. As a forensic research psychologist, she also is interested in the role of ethics in digital forensics and internet-based research. Today she will present a talk titled Analyzing the Ashley Madison Dataset. Please silence your electronic devices, but don't put them away. We want you tweeting the hashtag Dawn or Doom. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Siegfried Spellar.
Wow. All right, thank you guys. So we're here to talk about Ashley Madison. So just really quick, how many of you have heard of Ashley Madison? All right, good. So no one's been living in a hole for a while. Okay, perfect. So just some of the things that you probably are familiar with already. About 15,000 emails were found that were government related. We also have some research that was going on regarding some passwords. We have concerns about ESPN workers. There's even been findings that .edu was found in the data set. So academics, students are using this website as well. So we're going to kind of talk about Ashley Madison today. Let's give you a timeline for it. So Ashley Madison actually started in 2001 and currently has a net worth of about $100 billion. And we also see that it has about 53 countries that are actually using this website. Fast forward to 2015. So in July, what we saw was the Impact Team. So the Impact Team was a hacktivist group that decided to target this company, Avid Media, because they were concerned about the morality of the website. So July 12th, they said, look, Avid Life Media, if you don't take down this website, we're going to release customer information that we've been collecting since 2008. They then made this public, or this notice, or this threat public, so on the 18th. So now everybody knew, and everybody was waiting. So the news started to cover this idea. Are they going to actually do this? Well, the 18th came, so 30 days later, after that deadline, they said, time's up. So that's exactly what happened. On August 18th, Impact Team posted this notice saying that time's up, and they released in 3 different data sets over 30 gigabytes of customer information. So this customer information, what did it have? First and last names, email addresses, locations of addresses, so where these people actually lived. Their profile also had photos. So they also claimed that there were naked photos, although they haven't released them yet. That doesn't mean that they won't in the future. So other things that are in the data set, the likes of these individuals. So on this profile, you listed your sexual fantasies and interests that you had. So that's pretty personal information. Most of you are nodding going, yeah. We also, that's pretty personal, right? So we also have about 9 million credit card transactions as well. So now we have credit card information. So not only can you look up an individual, you can find out how many times that person charged for the services, what the services were, how many times they actually met up with somebody. You could find out those sexual fantasies. And also through this, you could find out the fantasies that that other person had. So very personal information in this database. The other thing that the Impact Team talked about was something called the ghost erase. So this idea that you paid $19 if you no longer wanted your information on this website. If you wanted to hide any trace that you've ever used Ashley Madison, the company said, no problem. Simply pay us $19 and we will wipe everything. We will delete your profile. So again, it's called a ghost erase. Last year alone, they made $1.7 million in fees. That's a lot of people who either changed their mind or decided they didn't want their information known anymore. But there's a problem. The problem the Impact Team revealed is that this information was never deleted. So customers were paying for a service that they actually never received. They were paying, trusting that the company had erased their information, and it's still on there. So now that 30 gigabytes of information, right? There's over 36 million profiles. Those are just the known profiles. There's also profiles out there of people who thought they were deleted and wanted their information hidden. So now here's the aftermath. So we have the 18th, some of this information's released. What were people saying? Well, you gotta love our meme people. So first we have some memes coming out, thinking this is funny. Diverse attorneys are gonna be making a ton of money this year, right? We also see people saying, why are we so concerned about this like hack, right? These are immoral persons. So all the impact team did was reveal a secrecy that they were trying to hide. It's a good thing that the impact team did this. We also heard news that 2 clients at least have claimed to have committed suicide. So they left suicide notes stating that the reason they committed suicide was because of the Ashley Madison hack. So we have news reports saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be blaming these victims and saying that it's okay and just. Just because they're immoral, does that mean that this behavior should have occurred? We have this tweet that I really liked as well. This person said it was a Gawker's Christmas. So we have a chance to download this data, because it's public, it's been posted out there, you can get it, and look through it and gawk. Is your mom and dad on it? Is your next door neighbor? Is somebody in your department or a student? You can find this information out. And then what I found the most interesting was that there was this ethical conundrum from researchers. So we saw bloggers and journalists and researchers wondering if we were allowed to analyze the data set. And this actually happened to me. So I had a student who sent me an email with the data set saying, hey, got this data set, we should analyze it. I mean, hell, I thought it was Christmas. I'm like, oh, this is great. I can get some publications out of this. You know, I can look through and maybe identify password vulnerabilities and look at passwords related to, jobs. So what type of military, if you have a .mil address, what types of passwords are you using versus somebody with a .gov? So I was getting really excited about this. And I thought, well, I wonder if this is ethical, right? Should I look at data that these people didn't consent to? And then I realized other people are asking the same question. There was this kind of concern, this question. So talking about analyzing the data set, that's what we're here today about, right? Did Dr. K analyze the data set? Well, first I had to determine, is it ethical? Is it okay for me to do this? But then on the other hand, who cares, right? Like, who the hell cares? I need to get tenure, I need publications, right? Some of us are going, they're cheaters. They cheated, they're immoral people. Or these were people who were at least interested in cheating, whether or not they actually did it. So this was kind of the flip side. If you read some of the Reddit blogs on whether or not we should look at this data, this is what you saw. The people who were like, no, it's not ethical, and the others were like, who gives a crap? We're going to do it anyway. So to determine if it's ethical, we have to look at the history of ethics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of ethics just to give you guys a background of what my world is like and where I'm coming from. So the next slide is going to have some pictures that might be a little upsetting, but I think they're really important for you guys to understand what I mean by research ethics. So research ethics all started because of World War II. So after World War II, we had something called the Nuremberg Code, which I'm going to talk about next. But what was happening is that we were using POWs at this time for research. The Nazis were. And so just a couple examples up here, the top left, they would actually conduct surgeries where they would actually insert dirt and glass and metal shards into the person's body, sew them back up, let it get infected for a couple weeks, and then try to do surgery. So they were trying to see if they could learn surgical ways of improving when soldiers came off the field. They also would, on the bottom left picture, they would actually take limbs and amputate limbs, and then they wanted to see if they could reattach those limbs. Or they would just practice amputations, because again, they would have soldiers coming back with these problems. They were really interested in creating a perfect super race, so they wanted individuals with blue eyes and blonde hair. So they did a lot of twin studies. And some of these twin studies, they actually created their own Siamese twins. So they would take 2 twins and sew them together and see how long they would live. They also did some experiments with whether or not somebody could survive drinking salt water. And they also did some hypothermia research as well. So the research that was conducted at this time was not ethical. These individuals did not consent to it, and this was the beginning of how do we define what research ethics is. It's from World War II. So after this, we have this famous doctor's trial where 23 doctors were put on trial for the types of crimes that were committed, for the medical research that was going on at the time. So after that, the Nuremberg Code in 1947 was created. It's kind of our 10 commandments for research. You can think of it that way. So there's 10 of them, but I'm only going to talk about 3 of them, kind of the ones that are really important here. And they carry on later as well. this idea of informed consent. So if you're going to participate in research, you have to know exactly what you're doing and what's going to happen. You have to be informed. And it also has to be voluntary. So meaning, I can't hold a gun to you and say, do you volunteer for this research study? Yes, I have consent, right? That doesn't work. So it has to be voluntary, not coerced. Another one is that the results must be for the greater good. This is going to come up later when we're talking about analyzing the Ashley-Madison dataset. Are the results that I'm going to get from that dataset for the greater good? Does it outweigh the harm that these individuals experience since they did not consent to the study or consent to their information being released? After that, we have two more reports or declarations that were created. So 1964 was the first time that we thought, well, who gets to decide whether research is ethical? I'm a researcher, I'm going to go, it's ethical, and then run with it, right? Well, now we have a third party that is supposed to review all of our research protocols to decide whether or not it meets ethical standards. So that was 1964. So some of you might have heard of the Institutional Review Board. That's what we have as academic institutions. Then in 1979, we said, well, how are these institutional review boards supposed to decide what's ethical? We should make guidelines for them. That way it's fair for everybody. They have the same guidelines that they review for every single type of research. So the Belmont Report came out in 1979. So the one thing you should notice, though, is that this is all really before internet technology, right? Some of the concerns that we have now is ethics with looking at data online. So I can tell you, there's no research guidelines or ethical guidelines for the use of compromised data. There is no written report or standard that tells me I cannot use data that's put online, even if that data was stolen, for example. So that's the first thing. So should I be allowed to conduct ethical research on unethical data? Well, this question has been asked before. So the results that were compiled after World War II, those exist. That data is actually out there. And researchers have tried to look at it because they can see the potential for that research, the potential to explain things with hypothermia, for example. There's research questions. But should researchers be able to look at that data? Those individuals were tortured. They didn't consent to it. So the arguments come from a utility versus legitimacy perspective. The utility being, I can use this data for the better good. This data can help me. The legitimacy saying, if I look at this data set, am I legitimizing the way that it was obtained? Am I saying it was okay for what happened in World War II? Am I saying it was okay that hackers went in and got the data and posted it online? Am I supporting these behaviors? So it all comes down to utility versus legitimacy. This is my dilemma. This idea of ethical research with unethical data. And again, some of you are going to go, so what? Right? Like, oh, woe is you. I'm not a researcher. I'm just some citizen, or I'm just a person who has internet access. I want to go download the data and look. Ethics doesn't apply to me. I'm just a consumer of information. That information is posted publicly. Why can't I go through and look at it? Some of you are thinking that. I'm saying it does matter. I'm saying ethics does matter. So you have to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, though, to really understand how this could impact us. Going back to that tweet, that idea that looking at the Ashley-Madison dataset is a Gawker's Christmas. So I'm going to ask, are we as a society legitimizing or encouraging future hackers to compromise data sets and post them online when we as researchers, bloggers, journalists, when we write about this information? Or when we are internet users and we just go online and download it? Are we supporting this type of behavior? Are we encouraging it? And what if the next time it was your information? What if it has nothing to do with immoral behaviors? How would you feel then? I would say it would not be Christmas for you, right? Everybody else who's a Gawker, though, is going to see it as Christmas, but it's not for you anymore. So this is the age of the hacktivist. So we are seeing this movement, especially starting in 2012 with Anonymous. They're probably the most famous group. But we're seeing this idea of the hacktivist, right? This moral ability to go online and take information and post it publicly for the world, for the better good of humanity. These are our Robin Hoods. So this is the age of the hacktivist. So what does that mean? The Ashley Madison hack is not the first, and it's not going to be the last. So this is going to happen again. And the other thing I can say is that research has shown that computer-mediated technologies, they influence the way we make decisions. And the way that we act online now is very different than the way we probably act in the real world. So we can see morality changing. The way that cyberbullying has really occurred. Trolling, look at trolling. The way you can post anonymously, comments online. Because you're hiding behind a computer screen, you have that anonymity that protects you, or at least that pseudo-anonymity makes you feel safe. So technology has a way of influencing our morals and our ethics. So the question of, is the violation of people's privacy something that we're willing to support? And I'm saying people here, regardless of whether or not these people are, quote unquote, immoral, right? Because that would be the argument from the Ashley Madison data set. Who cares? They're cheaters. They're immoral people. We'll take immorality just take that out of the picture. Are we willing to support this type of behavior? Because if we are, then I would argue that society's morality is more than just threatened. But that's what's going to be doomed. So I plan for more discussion than anything. And I also, because I think this is a really profound question. Go for it.
Well, we've had 70 years to think about the Nazi
Yeah.
experiments, but hasn't it been decided? If it's still up for question, then I don't see Ashley Madison being a big problem.
So what's been up for, whether you can use ethical.
Whether it's legitimate to look at the Nazi data
So,
to do additional research on it.
So what happens is we haven't seen a major discussion comparing compromised data. The only comparison that we have is what happened with the Nazis. So that's the only comparison, if you look in the literature right now, that you're going to see. And people can say that's a pretty crazy, right, comparison. But
are you allowed to publish data using the Nazis?
No one has been able to yet. But that doesn't mean that you can't. Or that somebody won't be able to in the future, because it all comes down to that utility argument. Can you make the argument so that the use of this data is greater than the risks of what happened to the individuals with this data originally? And so that's the argument. So with the Nazi data, I probably don't see any argument that could happen with that. But with the Ashley Madison data set, could somebody make the argument that looking at this data set is for the greater good? So if I promise to wipe the data set, I'm going to remove all the anonymity, make it anonymous, remove all identifying factors, and then look at, for example, passwords and relationships between passwords and email addresses. I could probably do something like that, but my question is greater than that. Should we even do that? Should I even look at that information? Because if I do download the data and look at it and analyze it, am I not encouraging it, or at least making the impact teams feel like we see this as legitimate behavior, that we're okay with it?
Well, you could make the same argument about the Nazi experiment. You could say that, we really need to know how to bring people back from freezing conditions. And the Nazis might have been wrong to do that, but it's done.
Well, and that's the arguments that have been made, but no one has been able to get the data and had a strong enough argument.
I have two questions.
Yeah, please.
One is the reason that people haven't been able to use the Nazi research data because IRBs haven't approved it? Or is it like national governments that hold the information? My second question is, I don't think you ever told us if you're actually analyzing the Ashley Madison data set.
So no, I'll answer the second one. No, I chose not to analyze it. And I actually found it to be a great chance to talk with my students about kind of where they were coming from, why they thought it was right or wrong. And I actually met with some different IRB individuals to see kind of what they would say if I submitted a protocol and said I was going to wipe it or clean it, what they would think. And it is, they kind of all came back and said, well, we would have to sit down and look at every case individually because we don't have a protocol for handling that type of thing, right? Going back to the first question was, remind me.
Oh, is the reason that people haven't been able
yes.
to analyze Nazi data because IRB hasn't approved it, or various IRBs,
Yes,
or because
yes, that
national
would be why.
governments won't release it?
IRB.
Okay.
Yeah. Because it mainly comes down to the concern. There's the legitimacy argument with that, but there's also the validity concern. So another argument with the research being kind of this, having the scientific merit to it, you don't know whether or not the notes that were taken at the time are valid or if they're consistent. You know, so looking at the data, people would say you're not going to be able to draw anything scientifically from it because of concerns about validity. Sort of the same thing you saw with the Ashley Madison data set with people arguing, well, we don't know if there are women on there or if these were fembots or what was going on. So they're saying, well, why would you want to look at the research anyway from an academic perspective because we have validity concerns.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you said ethics was defined by doing it for the greater good, but good is kind of a subjective term. What is
Yeah.
good for me is not good for somebody else. So as a researcher, how do you know that whatever you're doing is for the greater good? Like, what do you define as greater good?
Yeah, so that's the reason why we have the third party. So what I think, or what I'm willing to do, or what I think is for the greater good, that's why I have to have a third party group, the Institutional Review Board, review that to see whether or not they would agree that what I'm about to do is for the greater good. Does that make sense? Because it does get defined differently for each individual or in everybody's research areas. So with what you're going to see with biomedical research, it's going to be completely different with what I do. Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, that's it. Sorry. Yeah.
There was this movie, Ex Machina, and it's about a Turing test of an AI. And basically they use the gentleman's pornography profile to shape the image of the robot, right? Which brings up kind of a similar question. This data, ultimately, this stuff could be used for psychological profiling.
Yes, which is what my area is. So that's why I was really excited.
Are we concerned about that? Or is the data too incomplete at this point?
So you're concerned with whether or not somebody could use that data to profile?
Absolutely.
So, well, I mean, so I think one of the issues I kind of discussed a second ago would be the validity of the data set. So there's a lot of concerns about were these really females or which ones are robots, and then you have concerns about people saying that their emails were in there, but that wasn't even, they weren't using the website. So I don't know if you could actually draw valid conclusions from the data set. But that's, so spinning off of that though, if there was a perfect data set in the world that got posted that I knew was valid and I could use that for this greater good, it would be interesting to see if that argument would be supported in overcoming, you know, the fact that it was compromised data. So that's kind of where this, again, this research ethics, but I don't know if profiling people would be a good enough reason to overcome the fact that they didn't consent to the data set.
I just think it would be so easy to track your online and build this complete profile of who you are, where you go, what you do.
Yeah, well, like one of the things, so my research, again, I look at deviant pornography use, and so I would be really interested, deviant is in what you wouldn't consider mainstream and normal, right? Whether or not it's socially acceptable. So I was really interested in looking at, you know, what were men looking at or what were women looking at, and then which ones were meeting up and not meeting up. And so, yeah, you could definitely go in and look at that, but I'm not going to. So I'm not touching it, so. Yeah.
What's the state of discussion amongst IRBs to normalize this, these decisions? Because as much as I respect your decision very much,
Oh, thank you so much.
the cynical me says if we meet again a year from now, there will be papers published on this data.
Oh, I'm sure.
So we don't have enough consistency in the IRB ranks for someone to say no.
Well, and so one of the problems too with that, I went and met with somebody from IRB, and this person had not heard of the Ashley Madison hack. This was like 2 months later. So as a researcher, I'm thinking, man, that would have been the key window to shove something through protocol, right? Because, I mean, this person doesn't even know what I'm talking about. And so, that's one of the problems with technology. Information is changing so quickly that what if it's on the dark web and it wasn't made public? What if I found the data set? You know, they don't know how I got it, and then I could push something through that way. And so there are There are concerns. So that's my biggest concern is the Institutional Review Board really understanding what we mean by compromised data and how the dark net plays a role with this, and how I can go onto the dark net, hire a hacker to get data for me and send it to me, and then I can continue my merry way towards tenure, right? So these are some of the bigger questions that I have. Are people going to do this? I don't know. How desperate could you be? I can tell you I'm pretty desperate, just to be clear. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah. It's concerning that I know that I have these ethics, because the world would be so much easier if I didn't have these ethics. I would just be moving along, right?
Well, then you can make up data.
Yeah, that's true. Yes. Oh, I think you had next.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So coming off of the ethical question, if there was a way to just eliminate all the user names or email addresses and just analyze the passwords or the other data that's completely anonymous that no one probably knows,
Yes.
would that be ethical? Is that a solution to this question?
So that would be the argument as a researcher, that I could take the data set, anonymize it, de-identify it, and then analyze it. But then IRB needs to decide those individuals never consented in the first place. So should I be allowed to even look at that information, even if I can promise that the results of it are going to be anonymous? Does that make sense? Yeah. So I would have to make the argument that the greater good, right, whatever the research question that's coming out of this is so great that I know they didn't consent to it, but I'm protecting them as much as I can, and it really outweighs the risks to those individuals. I don't know if we could do that, if there would be that profound question.
Undocumented suicides would be a pretty good negative.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And those are just the ones that are documented, exactly. I think I saw more. Would you pass that down, please?
There are organizations that do research that wouldn't have a university IRB.
Absolutely.
And let's take a concrete example. Suppose I was a member of a small political organization, and I felt it was necessary to learn whether either any of the candidates that we support is actually on Ashley Madison. I might feel, well, we need to search for those names, but we don't have an IRB, so who's to determine? And take a large company, it's the same kind of question could arise.
Right, and the same question comes down to just being a normal person, right? Wanting to know if your spouse is on there, or if there's, or the people the coworkers that you're with. Yeah, so no, so that would be going back to the idea that we're governed by our morality, right? So that we're the ones that end up making the ultimate decision. So part of the paper that I was working on for this was this idea that, what if IRB came back and told me it was okay? So yeah, you can analyze the data set. You have IRB approval. Well, then do I, as a moral person, think that that's okay? Would I allow it? And so that's what, even then I would say no. I don't think it's right, even if I have a third-party person saying it's fine. So in this case, if you don't have that third-party person, then we have to rely on our morals. And I would argue that you shouldn't look at the data, because then you're encouraging it to happen again. But again, that's the argument, right? Yeah, no, you're fine.
One of the things that you were comparing was to the Nazi trials, but different people have actually already taken hacked passwords and used them and studied them, and it's been approved by different IRBs, not here at Purdue, but at different universities. I think there were some out of France, some out of England. Yeah. So in that regard, hasn't that decision then already been made by an IRB, and can you not use that as, I don't want to say proof, but kind of as support for an argument of, this has already been analyzed by different entities and they have said that this is okay?
Yes, so you could argue that if another institutional review board has analyzed it, that it would be okay. Now, the standards that are for international agencies or organizations may or may not be perfectly aligned, and they may have more leeway. So I don't know how much it would carry over. I do know, I can give, just from talking with students who were at other institutions, their IRBs approved things because they didn't understand where the data actually came from. So if they would have written it the way it probably should have been, it wouldn't have been approved. So I also think that if they were approved, it may have been not because they understood the data. Yeah. No, don't say sorry, I get a workout. No, it's good.
I may or may not work for Purdue.
Yes.
And I may or may not be in security.
Okay,
And there may or may not be, I may or may not be being watched right now. Anyway, no.
No.
So say this happened, and we had to look at it from the point of view of, well, this is going to cause problems. We have to analyze this data to make sure that we can have some foresight to make sure that important people or certain situations don't arise or are handled correctly. Is that immoral?
So for a non-academic, you're saying to look at the data for that reason?
I'm saying
Just an individual.
a person in the corporation that kind of, it's their job to like help.
Right.
Is it still, I mean, that's a hard line. I mean, we need to know because we need to know so that we can help avoid some of these problems, right?
Right, so trying to understand exactly how the hack occurred, trying to understand the vulnerabilities.
We were as far as who was in the list because
Yeah.
we had to know, we had to take it.
Yeah, well, and I think, so what I would say is whatever can help you sleep at night, right? So, and the organization sleep at night, right, absolutely. So, and I think that, and I would argue then that this is not a gawking type scenario, right? You were really looking at this because there's a question that you're trying to gauge. Another concern that we have when we have this type of data is, well, I'm just going to see what I find. So this kind of data mining, grounded theory approach of, well, we have information, I'm just going to start fishing for stuff. So that's another thing that you can't do with institutional review boards, right? So if I'm going to get it approved, I can't just tell them, I have this data set and I want to see what I can find. No, I have to know what the research question is and how this data set can answer it. It sounds like you have these concerns. You know this data set is going to help you answer it. So I would say that, I mean, that's a fine line, but it sounds like you were doing it, or they were doing it for the right reasons, right? Yeah. Yeah, but again, that's not a gawking type scenario, right? That's not, me just sitting behind my computer to download it to be nosy and to be insensitive and to laugh and say these are immoral people who deserved it. But don't quote me on approving it, right? So, yeah, I sponsored this. Yeah.
So I understand about your morality and ethical perspective to this. But as a researcher, I'm wondering, when you just heard about this data set, automatically you connected and you said passwords across different domains, what could be the relationships? Great research question. So how do you still keep up the passion for that research question? And what else do you do to find information to potentially find an answer to that question?
So one of the things that we could do is, because I actually talked to IRB. IRB would come back and say, well, that's a great research question. Can't you just ask for the data? Companies will strip that information, give you the data, and then you can go through it and do those types of analyses. So if you can obtain the data in an ethical manner, then yeah, go for it. But so that would be a way of getting around it. So that's how you could do the exact same research, answer those really interesting questions, but from the right path. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
In those cases, how do you feel about the consent part of it, implied consent versus explicit consent? And let me give you an example. I assume it hasn't changed since I left Purdue, but there's the most fought over sentence in the electronic policy of this university is, you have no expectation of privacy when using electronic resources of Purdue University. Approved by the Board of Trustees.
Yep.
Right there.
That's true.
Simple sentence. Therefore, does that say you would have no ethical issue with any Purdue data set in that regard?
Would I have an ethical issue with it if it was, scrubbed?
Does that,
no.
well, or it completely, there was consent. I consent by implied consent that I live with the policies of the university.
Right. So if you're saying
So
if
why
somebody,
scrub it?
well, IRB is going to come back and say that you have to, even though if they have consent, you have to take, and they can give you the data set, and that's the confidentiality aspect of it. I would have to promise confidentiality, scrub it, and then publish the information with it anonymously. So that is the same with when we're talking about law enforcement cases. We have, I'm sure, say it was at the University of Alabama, was that before too. But, you know, same with law enforcement cases. We can talk about the cases, but as long as we don't mention names, you know, that's how you can get around some of those issues too. Anybody else?
Actually, this isn't so much a question as a comment, because I think it's interesting. But DOD has come out and said that they actually are going to scrub the data, because technically speaking, under UCMJ, which is the law that governs all soldiers and sailors and otherwise, adultery is illegal and actually is a punishable offense. So they're now looking, potentially going back through the list and find out who signed up with a .mil account or any other related account to the military, and see to potentially levy charges against them for violating UCMJ. Now, obviously, that's a different set of laws than Joe user on the internet, but it certainly creates that ethical dilemma. I think that are they right for doing that?
Right. So, and I think that gets back to what Scott was saying about this idea that two of the individuals committed suicide, right? So if we're going to make this argument for greater good, or that the data has some value to it and that it outweighs the risks, well, that's a risk right there. That could potentially happen. And I was at the University of Alabama for 3 years before I came here. And so in Alabama, you can actually be charged with adultery as well. Now, whether or not that happens, I don't know. Well, I can tell you it's still on the books. And I did look at some of when I was researching a little bit about this. So some journalists and some security experts have already gone through and analyzed the data and talked about the number of women, the number of states. And Alabama was the top state in the United States, yay Alabama, that was that had the most individuals that were using Ashley Madison. So when you're comparing all the states, so again, maybe that could come back with potential repercussions. Probably not, but it's still a dilemma.
Is there any reason at all?
Yeah.
Is there any reason at all to believe that the list is accurate? I've heard they've had incentives to make it look like there were more women on the site than there really were.
Right.
So, I just don't know how you would validate it. How, you know, if you look for your political candidate, see if he's on the list. Turns out he's not on the list, but your opponent is. And then, you know, maybe it really turns out the opponent never signed up for it. Someone signed up for him. It seems there's all kinds of ways innocent people could be destroyed by this. And
yeah, I think Joe Biden's son was
know?
one of those who came out saying that his email was in there, but that it wasn't, that he didn't use it. So, I mean, that would be a prime example.
Right. And as for the suicides, I think 20,000 people a year commit suicide, so that's a couple every hour. And if millions of people were on the site, you would expect a lot of suicides just for other reasons.
Yeah. Well, and that, again, those are just the suicides that left notes, you know, really blaming Ashley Madison, so who knows, right? Any other questions or comments? Great.
I was trying to remember if there was a clause when trying to decide whether data is okay to be reviewed, and this Ashley Madison, of course, isn't going to fall into the time frame. The World War II ones that you're talking about in May, wasn't there a clause that after the records, the patient or whoever has deceased, or the records, the people that's about have deceased after so many years, then it's able to be reviewed?
I don't know.
And I mean, I don't even know what the statistics are on, you know, how many victims are still alive from, you know, the World War II stuff.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know if that clause is still in existence. So maybe that would be the argument, is that once, because that's the main argument, right, is legitimizing those victims. So, or legitimizing the behavior that occurred. So maybe after time, when they've passed, then researchers would then argue that now is the time. I don't know. I don't know if there's a clause for that.
So they could hold on to the data and table it until the time frame that it could be considered.
Right. It's interesting. Interesting argument. Oh, right behind you.
So you talked about utility versus legitimacy.
Yes.
And I was wondering if there's another thing about, like, there is some damage, and so if you can have a research that can do something positive, does that kind of make something good happen out of something that was bad? Like, do you think that's a possible, like, if you're able to at least get something good out of other people's suffering, maybe that's another way to look at it.
Yeah, and that would fill in beautifully with that argument, right, of the utility from it. So trying to really take what was collected, that data, and make something good out of it. But people, especially when you're talking about the World War II experiments, I mean, no one's going to look at that data. So, yeah, but that's been an argument. Is there anybody else? Yeah, please.
You were talking about Joe Biden's son saying that his email was on the list.
I read a lot about this, so I
yeah.
think that's one of the many articles I read.
Right.
Yeah.
There was a story on NPR a couple weeks ago about a man who had been married for like 40 years, and his Gmail account showed up on there. And he was on vacation with his wife, romantic vacation in Hawaii, and he had to explain to her he had never signed up, and then they went through this very long process trying to deal with this.
Yeah.
And I wondered, I don't know if this fits with the kind of research that you do, but have you thought about doing research on the Ashley Madison data hack without actually using the data, like trying to find people who said, my email was used by someone else inappropriately, and then finding out the consequences of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that would be another great avenue for obtaining information. I have not thought about it. Because Ashley Madison's a little bit outside of my area as far as looking at cheating behaviors, but there's other researchers that have been talking about conducting similar type studies. Well, this is what I was hoping for. Was hoping for more discussion and less sage on a stage type lecturing. So I really appreciate you guys coming, and I will be, staying after if you want to come up and talk more about this ethical dilemma that we have. So thank you guys so much.